We can start exactly where the panelists have left with this idea that what we need now is actually to implement and to see what it looks like in classroom for teachers, that we've tried to design and deploy, and to collaborate with people to make that happen and to build on all the collective intelligence of teachers and what's going on in countries. And so that's basically, and of course you can see with collective intelligence at the OECD as well, with all my colleagues working on that. And that's basically what I'm going to present before lunch. So, we're in England, we have one of the most creative novelists or writers, and actually that's what we've been doing this morning already, trying to think about a lot of things which are difficult, if not impossible. And I think we need to continue to have this kind of discipline. That's what the agenda also is about. For us, I think the set of why creativity and critical thinking are so important has been very well set already this morning, so there isn't much time to spend on that. Here, we're showing what a survey of CEOs of large companies and multinational companies said were the most important skills today, were the one that would be the most important, and as you can see that creativity and critical thinking are among this list, and actually creativity undertaking, becoming more important than critical thinking according to them, basically for all the reasons that have already been discussed this morning. For us at the OECD, we're an economic organization. OECD stands for Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and it comes from the innovation agenda. So we started by wondering, how do we actually empower people to innovate, acknowledging that innovation would be one of the drivers of growth. And so one of the questions we had was, what are the skills which are actually involved in innovation? And what we found, using different types of surveys, that people who actually are working, so have an employment, etc., when they work in an organization that is innovative and that they participate themselves in innovation, if you ask them what are you doing in your job, and what's important in your job, you can see that actually coming with new ideas and solutions, or the willingness to question ideas, and a few other things are actually 4 times as likely to be very important in their job compared to those who do not work in this kind of environment. So, we could see that these are very important skills, and the big question was, how do we actually try to develop them, and how do they are integrated in education systems? So Andreas presented, the kind of a general framework that we have at the OECD on that. In our case, we were very much interested in the skills for innovation, and so how do we actually categorize them? And we came up with this kind of categorization where we only talk about skills. You have the technical skills, know what and the know what, so the content and the procedural knowledge in domains or in disciplines. You have the creativity and the critical thinking skills, and I'm going to talk more about that. And then you have the behavioral and social skills, or the social and emotional skills. And actually, we do work on all of these categories of skills at the OECD. I would say that, PISA mainly measures, the technical skills in different domains. We have this study that Andreas presented this morning on social and emotional skills, which very much focuses on that. And our work in CERI which is actually part of it, is a CERI study. And we have very much focused on the creativity and the critical thinking, and possibly PISA 2021 will have a lot of countries participating also to be actually part in the creative thinking domain, so that we gain more knowledge in all these things. What's important is that we need to develop all these skills in all the disciplines, so that the knowledge is different level. These skills actually overlap. You need a little bit of, if you're not persistent, you're not going to learn much. If you don't know anything, you're not going to be creative or have much critical thinking. And, so there is an overlap, but what's important is that these skills are also different. And so if we don't pay attention to all of them, they are very much unlikely to be developed in schools. But even so, we are an economic organization. We also think of the well-being. That's one of the big evolutions of the OECD. We are much broader than we used to be, and so we are also having this plea for well-being. And actually, creativity is one of the things that people like. Like we talked about complexity in the previous panel, and so there is a lot of work in positive psychology showing how actually it's important for the well-being of people. Actually, critical thinking too, that's two of the examples. These are two philosophers, and they seem very happy. Well, they're dead, unfortunately, but they used to be. That's and that's a bit the same. That's not only essential to democracy and from a very long time ago, but it's also something which is very much gratifying for human beings. So that's another reason why we are promoting this agenda. Now, the big question is, that's one of my favorite quotes in Alice. When I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. And it's true for many people, and that's one of the problems that we have in some ways. What do we mean exactly when we talk about creativity and critical thinking? And that's one of the questions that actually an English academic asks us once, says, "Oh, I fully agree with what you're saying. Creativity, I like it very much. But tell me what it means for, in mathematics in grade 9, and then I'm going to write the textbook for you." And I think that was a good question, and I wasn't quite sure what the answer was. And so part of it, and the project that we've been carrying out over the past years, was trying to answer this question, not just in mathematics, but in also many other domains. And partly because, indeed, there is, I would say, overall strong consensus that it is important. Creativity, critical thinking are parts of the curricula of virtually all OECD countries. Surveys show that people are not strongly against them. Teachers are not against them. The big question is, what does it change in our daily practice? What do we mean? So we started working that, in fact, they already know in some ways. So, articulating a common international language had also to come from the teachers, and working with them. There is a lot of tacit knowledge that needs to become more explicit. And the whole idea was, let's try to make it visible to people what it actually means in practice, develop a language, and show a lot of examples of how this can be done. We know that, just showing is not enough. You need also professional development plans. And so we had to work on what are the kind of feasible ways of doing it. And because, at the OECD, we like to say that you need to evaluate everything that you do, we try to walk our talk and to actually try to develop instruments that would allow us to evaluate in a second stage, the work that we will have done. So we've been working over 2 school years, so it's a 5-year project. We've been working during 2 school years in 11 countries, 800 teachers and 20,000 students, and in primary schools and secondary schools. And you can see that the countries are very diverse. We have Brazil, France, India, Hungary, the Netherlands, Russia, Slovakia, Thailand, United States, Wales, Spain. So it's not like we have all the Nordic countries or all the English-speaking countries, or very diverse cultures, very diverse ways of thinking about teaching and learning. And so that's been really a tremendous experience. And so when I was saying that it's based on collective intelligence and collaboration, well, that's really what it is. And many of the people who participated are in the room today. And actually, it's really a big thank you to them as well for taking us here. It wasn't easy. Some people said, "Oh, I wasn't sure we would reach that point, and actually we've managed." And so I think it's one of the lessons of all this journey. So what does it mean to build a professional representation? What we've tried to do is to do it through a bank of pedagogical resources. So first, of course, we've started to think of what do we mean exactly by creativity and critical thinking, and see what people were thinking about it. So indeed, it's a creativity, the ability to produce work that is both novel and appropriate. So Carl was saying it's correct and novel. Doesn't have to be correct in all the domains. Sometimes it's just appropriate so that it's adaptive, etc. And critical thinking is actually a mix of logical thinking and of critique or understanding that there are alternatives to different solutions. And so it's really about evaluating ideas relative to other ones. That's part of the work. So these are two distinct concepts. The objective is not the same. One, you want to produce something which is novel, to you at least, and appropriate. And the other one, you want to make a judgment about something. So it's not exactly the same thing, but there are commonalities. These are these complex skills that have a lot of things in common. And actually that you can foster, the sub-elements can be fostered commonly as well. So we've tried to do this thing with 4 different types of products or artifacts in this box. So first, rubrics, which is something that is very common in English-speaking countries, but in many European countries, people don't even know what a rubric is. So first thing you have to tell them is what a rubric is. Examples of lesson plans, pedagogical activities, examples of assessments, so how do you want to assess that, and example of student work. So we've been more successful in the 2 first areas than the 2 last ones, but we've managed nonetheless to collect information about all these different things. So the first thing was working on a rubric. So initially we thought that the rubrics would be the language, the international language. So we wanted people to work with rubrics to develop their pedagogical activities, to improve the existing activity that they had already designed, to assess their students, and to actually just better understand what they're talking about. And we've started with 1 rubric in the field, and then got the feedback from all the teachers, etc. And we ended up with a portfolio of rubrics. So we have now, I think, 12 different rubrics or something like that. They are all related. But we realized that just 1 was not enough. So here I'm showing you 1, which is what we call a conceptual rubric, which is not meant to assess the students, but just to design your actually pedagogical activities and your lesson plans. And basically, you can see there are 4 different domains: inquiring, imagining, doing, and reflecting, and which descriptors different ones for creativity and for critical thinking. So they are in the book, and you can find them easily, so I'm not going to go much into them. But the way we've designed them is actually I've done some work with Bill Lucas and Paul Collard before, and they've developed these 5 creative habits of mind rubric. We've analyzed rubrics from 17 different countries, rubrics and curricula, and then we've worked with people, and we actually did a kind of a quick prototyping, to speak like people who are in design and innovation, so that we would actually change iteratively all these different things. And so we've developed rubrics. So that's the easy rubric. We have one which is a bit more comprehensive, which we call the comprehensive rubric, and then we have the rubrics by different domains. We also have developed an assessment rubric, so in critical thinking, in creativity, which is to assess student work, either the product, so what they have actually produced, or if you consider process, because that's one of the problems with creativity, that sometimes, the process may have been good, but in fact the product is not so good at the end, and people wanted also to capture this dimension. What we've seen is that even so we were asking people to do that, this is not always enough, and in fact they also needed to have examples of pedagogical activities, of lesson plans, to show what are the kind of pedagogical techniques that I can use, what are the kind of tasks that I can give the students, so that they have actually the room and opportunities to develop their creativity and critical thinking. So as part of the process, we have developed with experts, the teams on the field, about 100 examples of lesson plans. We've been working in 5 domains: in science, mathematics, music, visual arts, and interdisciplinary. So we have them. And all the idea is actually not to give detailed lesson plans. They are not aligned with any particular curriculum. It's just to inspire people and give them some ideas of what could you do actually, to develop these different skills. And most of them, is a very important point, are anchored in the discipline, so that you work with your existing curriculum, and even with this curriculum, actually there is space to change your teaching in such ways that actually you can inspire the students. So one example, because we're in science, which more critical thinking related, is an example that was designed by colleagues at Michigan State University, and it's a curriculum. It's what controls my health. So it's a project-based learning science lesson, but which is very much related to this idea of a predictive framework, so that you start, and it's something which is very much related to the context of people where it has been developed, where many people have actually diabetes, and then you try to learn and to make assumptions about why this is happening, acquiring the knowledge, and then you look at how this works on different domains, how the family, so you work on genetics, on trying to see the impact on the heart, and you learn on plant growth, on the environment, etc. And then you end up with a community action project on how can we actually do something together to make our environment healthier. So all that is on our website. You can see the whole lesson. That's why I'm going so quickly on it. On the book page, you can find 30 lesson plans as of today, which are displayed. But what we've asked people to do is, how does it relate with this conceptual rubric that we have? And so we asked people to decompose their lesson plan so that they would actually identify and assess at what step they are giving the student the opportunity to develop some of these sub-skills of creativity and critical thinking, so that actually they can revise and they can feel like, oh, perhaps actually there isn't that much opportunity, or I should try to add some, specific task or whatever, so that it would actually be the case. We're not asking them to do it for all the lessons or to do everything all the time, but from time to time to have this dimension. What we've learned as well is that more information or more support was actually helpful to some of the teachers, and so we have developed with all the group design criteria for good lesson plans in some ways that would develop creativity and critical thinking, which are very much anchored also in the learning science in some ways. First thing, create the students' interest to learn, so give an interesting question. And we found that it's very difficult, because what we believe are interesting questions are not necessarily very interesting to other people in some cases. And so it seems to be very obvious, but what we've discovered is that it is not so obvious in practice to find these kind of things. Second point was to be challenging and challenging enough. Sometimes the tasks are so simple in some way that it's not interesting, and so it's very much related to the interest. Make sure that you have actual technical knowledge in the disciplines, so that it's not just a happening or something like that, but you're clear about what you're going to teach and what people are supposed to learn beyond the creativity or critical dimension. So if you do, for example, science, you have to be clear about what is the scientific content of your lesson, and not just that we're going to make connections with other things, or we're going to produce some artifact or something like that. But you need to have a product, so include a product as part of your lesson. One thing we've seen at the end of the first year was that some of the things that were actually the student work coming back from the field, we were surprised because all the student work was looking alike. And so that was a bit of a surprise. So, because that was supposed to be on creativity in many ways. And so one of the things that then we've added is, you have to have students co-design part of the product. So sometimes we realize that, if you're doing poetry, there are some constraints, and, these things may look alike, but even so they are different. But sometimes they could be much more different than, what people are doing. And so also paying attention to the kind of problems that are given to students is very important. You need to give them specific tasks that would allow them to develop, this creativity or this critical thinking, depending on what you're working on, and usually meaning that the problems can be looked at from different perspectives. The two last points is more from a teacher perspective, and so one of the feedback we got is that it's sometimes difficult to let go and actually not have the answer, or not knowing exactly how the lesson will go. And so leaving room for the unexpected is one of these very important points as well. Perhaps the students will lead you where you hadn't imagined, or in places you didn't want to go, and you have to accept that. You have to prepare, but accept that it may actually go in some places that are less I would say, predictable than what you would want in traditionally. And of course, at the end, it's just including space and time for reflection, and that's also part of the rubric. So it's the feedback we got is very much about balancing structure and openness, so you need to have appropriate tasks and assignments for it to happen. You can learn it in any discipline, actually, alongside technical skills. You can also learn it in multiple disciplines if you do interdisciplinary things. But you have to prepare a course that is well structured and has a strong learning architecture, but that actually give room and give students some agency so that they can actually also bring in something to the course and to the learning. Second thing that we were interested in is what are the kind of professional development plan that people should put in place. We know that what we are giving here, if you want, is, it's great, it's good, but even better if you can actually do it face-to-face. And one of the questions we had was, how does this connect with the idea of professional learning communities as well, and how these different things are happening. So the first point is, actually, innovation is professional development. That's one of the first things. When you're trying to change something, you will create some level of incompetence, and then hopefully people will start talking to each other, reflect on their practice, step back. And so if it's not too challenging, there will be learning that will happen as part of the process. What we've seen is that, what we asked the teams working with us, at a minimum, was to give an induction workshop at the beginning of the project. And usually, and we're very grateful for that, they did much, much more than that, So basically, usually there were 3 big components to it. Well, teacher training, and usually multiple sessions, individual follow-up of the teachers, usually by external experts, and opportunities to have peer learning, either online or face-to-face, so that people could talk to each other. This was very important. Second thing that we found was very important is it's when actually there was the explicit support from the district leaders, school principals, or people in the system, because that's really an enabling factor for teachers. This was a lot of interesting things. The most effective measured as teachers continued to work on the project after a while and to actually try to implement these things was actually all the continuous support. So the single induction session didn't work. In the places where this happened, we've lost most of the teachers who were actually working with us at the beginning. And a very important point, especially when you work at the OECD, is that all these plans that have been put in place are very affordable. So it's not like they require something which is particularly fancy. It's something that usually systems or school principals can actually do. So at the end, we can see that there was this effect of professional learning community. So that's based on the teachers answering these questions. And they say that basically what worked the most is that they talked much more with their colleagues about what was happening, and very positive feedback from school principals as well on that in terms of professional learning opportunities that the work has provided. You can see the one where there was a bit less there was discussion forums, and of course it depended on in the different teams. Some of them had set up online platforms, others hadn't, etc. So there is a bit more variation around that. But overall, I would say that we could see that there was a kind of professional learning community that actually happened thanks to the project and around the project on creativity and critical thinking. Last thing we wanted to do was to develop evaluation instruments. So that was basically how do we actually prepare ourselves to see whether the approaches that are piloted or used in the different places were actually working, and then, of course, trying to find out for whom they are working. So basically, what we've put in place is a framework with a quasi-experimental design, so that we had a control group, intervention group, and then we were asking people to take questionnaires and tests before and after. And we have actually successfully developed the instrument that would allow us to evaluate the efficacy or the effectiveness of this kind of work in a second stage. And this is something that we will talk about tomorrow as part of, what are the next steps? How can we move the agenda forward or continue to move it forward? Of course, we'll need participants if we want to continue in this, but we have actually field tested, piloted all these instruments, refined them over the 2 field years, and for most of them, we're kind of happy with how they respond, and so we have a framework that would allow. We've also evaluated the protocol so that we can see that something didn't work very well. Perhaps, we need to, it was a bit heavy for the teams, we realized, and so we have to see how we can make it work. But because when you develop and pilot field test instruments, you have to collect a lot of data. We also have tentative, results, which have to be taken for what they are, just a pilot data collection, but which also give us some information about other changes. One of the things that we wanted to see was that teachers would change their teaching practices. And actually, in that respect, the work worked pretty well. People have changed their way of thinking about creativity and critical thinking. They say that they're much more consistent in trying to foster their students' creativity and critical thinking. They've changed the way they are preparing their lessons, the way they design their assessment, and the way they assess their student work. So that's very much what we wanted to see in some ways, and that's, even though it's tentative, it's a very encouraging first things. They've also actually, for most cases, adopted very well the rubrics that they had and this idea of the rubrics, including actually where they were not popular tools that everybody knows. So you can see here that 30% have not used them so much, but 75 on average have used them to modify their lesson plans, to design the new lesson plans, etc. At some point, at least, during the, some often, some a bit less often. And we also had a lot of qualitative feedback, and so basically we could see that on the field, we had broad support for this creativity and critical thinking agenda. Of course, we worked with a self-selected group of teachers, but not always. In some cases, what we realized over time is that they were interested in the topic, but they realized that they knew a bit less than they believed initially on it, and that was one of the outcomes that we had. So they believed that it could be taught and learned. They were much more familiar with critical thinking than creativity, but they improved their understanding of what it means during the project. And they said, as I've mentioned, that they were much more consistent in fostering. Of course, what we found is that, once you start knowing more about something, then your views can change. And at the end, some of the teachers felt like, oh, perhaps we're not that well prepared, actually, to do it, because there was much greater awareness of the kind of changes that people had to put in place. So, what we found is that it's difficult. It's not something that you do that is very easy to do, or that, it really includes or requires some real change. Second thing we found is that teachers were usually reluctant to assess creativity or critical thinking. So, partly because initially they only had a conceptual rubric, so we've developed that. We hoped that it would come from the field, and then we ended up developing it more towards the end of the project. So they didn't have a tool, and they didn't feel very comfortable about assessing these different skills. So that's one of the things that we have also learned during this project. For the students, we have also a few students. So one of the interesting student outcomes is that actually the disadvantaged students have benefited particularly from this pilot intervention. So it's in many places that's what happened. So that worked well for low socioeconomic students from low socioeconomic background, or people who at the beginning of the study had a pretty poor understanding of what creativity or critical thinking actually meant. And if we look at the class level, we could find that the classes which had a challenging learning climate at the beginning, meaning that the teachers have to wait for a while before they can actually start their lessons, and so have less lesson time because of most likely disciplinary problems, were the ones that were actually we found the most benefit. Something which is a bit strange, but perhaps which actually relates to the variety of the type of teaching and and pedagogies across teams, is that we found perhaps a bit less common patterns across teams than what we would have thought at the beginning. So there is a very big diversity of the results across the different teams. And that's something that we would need to investigate more if we continue the work. So we worked with a few examples of similar to pedagogy. So for example, we had people working with project-based learning. So that was the case in France, for example, research-based learning, the case in France as well, creative partnerships in different of the programs that we had, design thinking of Fieldwork in some of, in the US or the Montessori. But what's interesting as well is that we had a lot of the teams which were not implementing any particular signature pedagogy. They were just doing their usual teaching and just trying to change these things, and integrate some new tasks in their usual ways of teaching. And that worked as well, so that we had sometimes interesting results based on this model. So, in conclusion, what have we learned? So, we have that is part of the book, so that's the time where I should do some advertisement. You all have your flyers, I hope, and, you have the advance sales notice until the 16th of October, then it will become expensive, but now it's very cheap. So what we've learned is that, well, first, creativity and critical thinking can be learned and assessed in all the different subjects. But of course, that we need to be very intentional and be clear about what we're trying to achieve. And so here, the rubrics and the other resources are actually very much helping in clarifying what we are thinking of. Teacher needs support. There is a certain level of professional development that has to come with these ideas. One is a remote professional development in some ways, it's having a community around resources, but one of it is actually face-to-face or online ways of learning. We also know that it's not easy. It takes time to work, but it's feasible, that's a good thing. And actually, real teachers in real-life settings have done it, so that it's not impossible at all. We also know that there are different ways of doing that. And actually, sometimes, it's just about starting the needle. And if we manage to get everyone moving along, then actually, perhaps in some time, we will be where, we say we want to be. So that's some of the good news. Currently, you have the pedagogical resources, which are a very important output of this project, beyond the book that you have. They will be available through a platform. A tablet application and a web application, and this will be released in a few months' time. And if you would be interested in piloting it, then just come. I'm going to talk about it and show you a little bit more tomorrow about that as well. But that would be something that we would be very interesting. And the idea is really, how can we actually make all these things accessible to more teachers, and in a way which is teacher-friendly, and so that they can actually use them as part of their practice. And so that's finishing with Alice again. Change is not easy. So that's one more of my favorite. I have many favorite quotes, as you can see. Alice says, oh, you generally get to somewhere else if you run very fast for a long time, as you've been doing. A slow sort of country, said the Queen. Now here, you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place, and if you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. And I think that's a good metaphor for where education systems are. Actually, just keeping the machinery going is already a lot of work, and so trying to get somewhere else is even more complicated. But this is not impossible, and so that's the good news, and so some people have done it, and if we really want, we can do it as well. So thank you very much.